This video is intended to be an introduction to Codesters, and Codesters is a coding platform to teach you how to use Python. I'm looking at this video with a perspective of teaching people who have a little bit of experience using block coding languages like Scratch. So you may hear me from time to time saying, well, this is how you would do it in Scratch, and here's how you do it in Codesters. If you don't know Scratch, that's fine. But if you do, maybe it'll help you get a little reference to it. So specifically, I'm speaking to my students who do have Scratch experience. But anyway, here I am in Codesters. Yours might look slightly different depending on when you log into Codesters, but at some point you're going to have to choose a class. So I'm just going to pick a class and I'm going to click on Start Coding. And when I do that, it's bringing up the very first coding project or coding set of lessons that Codesters offers. And what Codesters basically does, there is one mode where you are just following preset lessons that they have created and you go through them. So this is the very first one. This lesson is called Building Your First Program. And so this is typical. You will see a little preview come up. It discusses what's going to look like, and it says what you're going to do and some objectives that you have. It even has some example projects, and then you would just click Get Started. So before we even do anything, let's just look at the environment. My eye is drawn right to this area here, and this is that coding area. This is where you're going to type in all the program instructions, the Python instructions. In the lesson view, you really have to read the information up here. It's going to say Preview. Before we get started making our very first program, let's look at an example. Click the green circle, Run button to see an example of the program you will create today. This program has a background image and a sprite or character that moves and is clickable. Watch the fox move, then click on the fox once it stops moving to see what it does. Click this blue circle Submit and then the orange Next to continue. Now I went and laboriously read through all that. It is essential that you actually read all these things before you start messing around here. It's a very cool little environment because what's going to happen is you just do exactly what it says. So I'm clicking Run, and there's my fox, right? And then you get a little message up here. It's feedback from Codesters saying, great job. Be sure to click on your sprites. You're like, oh, okay, because it did say in the instructions here, that third bullet, click on the fox. So I'm like, okay, click on me. And it even tells us to and turns around. And then it's going to say, hey, click Submit and click Next. So when you finish one lesson, almost always that's what you will do. You click this blue Submit button. It tells Codesters, yeah, I'm done. And then this lets you move to the next activity. And if you don't do it in that order, it's probably going to say, are you sure you want to move to the next activity? And it gives you some feedback. It's not really sure what you want. And before we look at the next one, I'm going to look at sort of on the top here. There are a whole series of these circles. A green check mark means that the lesson piece is complete. Now I have already run through this lesson, so all of mine have green checks. If you haven't, they're going to be grayed out until you actually run them. So the blue is saying this is where you are. You're on, lesson number 2 here, step 2, and you're going to be doing the next thing. And you do have to read what this says. It says, let's look at a background image. Let's add a background image to the thing, right? And so you're going to read it. You're going to click on stage. You're going to do all the stuff it says here. Before we go through that, I do want to look at the toolkit area on the left side. A lot going on here as well. So the stage is a lot like what you get on Scratch. It's kind of that blank space. And you can pick a background image. And they have a whole list of them, a whole bunch of them. And so if you click on stage, this is what it looks like to actually set your stage. And so in the toolkit on the left, find stage and click on it. Notice the blue blocks. Find the one labeled summer. Now when you're in this preview lesson mode, it actually highlights it for you. And what's kind of cool is I'm going to hover the mouse. It shows you what it looks like. This one is like a palm tree. If you look at the school hallway, you'll get a different one. So you can sort of preview them kind of easily. And you have a couple of choices here. You can actually just end up dragging, and it takes the block and it turns it into text. So it's a little bit like Scratch in that you're dragging blocks over, but it turns it into text. And I'm just going to get rid of it because it's there already. Because I already did this lesson. So here it is, but that's what you would do. Now if you click Run, it's going to, obviously set that stage. and then you submit, and then you go to the next lesson. So you want to get these nice little messages saying everything worked. Just real briefly, I just want to show you some of these things that are on the left side. So those are your background images. You also have sprites, and we are familiar with sprites from Scratch if you've used that. These are the little objects that you can have in your projects. And so we've got a whole bunch of them too. And there is a place to browse. You can pick a whole bunch of different sprites that way, or you can go ahead and just go along the left. Now, what this does not have that Scratch does have, which is a really nice sprite design capability. This one, not so much. The best you can do is you can upload a sprite, but even that is a little difficult. You have to have a sprite that's in a URL on a website somewhere. It doesn't really upload like your own little JPEGs or things like that. It's not as easy to create your own sprites in Codesters as it is in Scratch. So Codesters is less of an animation tool like Scratch is. It's more of a coding tool. So you do a little bit less of the artwork. It's not zero. You can still do things, but not so much. So you have sprites. We do have shapes. Now the actions, these are things you might be somewhat familiar with from Scratch. You can say things, you can wait, you can ask questions, asking for input from somebody playing the game or using your project. You can move your sprites around, you've got pens. There's a lot of different things here that are kind of what you can see in Scratch, and we have physics, so you can add weight to some of your objects. And of course events, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Across the top, there's actually some tabs here. When you get into this part of this, you click on the Logic tab. This is where you can do things like have loops, if-else's, lists, which we've looked a little bit at Scratch, functions. We'll talk about what all these things are. But that's just how you find these things. So basically in this lesson mode, you're going to go through sequentially all of these things until you have all green checks. When you get to that final check, this one has you creating a project. And so they're little mini projects. They're not meant to be big, long projects, but you're using everything that you learned in each step leading up to this part, and it will tell you exactly what to do and what the expectation is. It has examples, and you can look at them, and then you will create it. So I think you will quickly figure all this stuff out when you actually get your hands on this. So I'm kind of leave this for now and let you kind of play around, and you'll see what your questions are when you get into it. Okay, for this part of the video, I want to show you how you can create your own projects outside of the Codesters provided lesson path. Basically, what you can do is, now it may look a little different on your end, but you're going to look along the side here and you're going to click on where it says projects. And I'm going to create a new project by clicking on that little plus new project. And then I get a little environment that looks a bit like what you were using when you were doing the lesson path, except these aren't lessons. You have free reign here on what you want to do, within Python, of course. So obviously the first thing you want to do is give it a name. So I'm going to call this my first Python project. And you want to describe what this project does, and this is going to be a very simple one. It's going to be mostly Hello World because that's always your first project, and maybe some other things, just to kind of get you familiar with the environment here. So the first thing you want to do when you create any project is you want to have comments along the top that explain a little bit about the project. There are different ways of doing this in Python. I'm going to use the hashtag indicator. So it's a little hashtag symbol. Once you put that on a line in a Python program, everything after that is ignored by the Python interpreter. So this is like blank space. So I'm going to skip a line there and I'm going to call this Hello World and some other demo things. Whoops. And that's what this project is going to be. And again, I'm putting in these little hashtag symbols or pound signs, number signs, whatever you want to call them, to say these are comments. There's no Python code in here, and it is completely ignored. Now, I do have a convention that my classes do. So if you are a student of mine, I want you to follow this class convention here. At the top, give me some status as to where this is. So I want like a completion status. So basically what I want something that says I'm done, I'm not done. So near the top where I can see it, I want some kind of status that says, yes, I'm done, no, I'm not. So since I'm just creating this, I'm obviously not done. So that is just your signal to me where you are in the process. So just want to make sure we have that. I just want to print out hello world. I just want to print out hello world. Now this version of Python that Codesters use it is 2.7, I believe, and it's an older version of Python. So if you've had Python experience, maybe some things are going to be different, but this is using version 2.7, and there is documentation provided on python.org if you ever want to see that. But I'm just going to use a print statement. So print, and then you use parentheses, and there's an open and a close. Sometimes if you're a person who always forgets your close, you can put them in at the same time and then just move backwards. And then you put the string you want printed out. It prints out a character string, so I'm going to do what's called a literal, which means I'm going to type out exactly what I want to be printed, and I'm putting it between two double quotes, and so it should just print that. How do I get this to run? Well, this is in the Codesters environment. So the green button always means run it. This blue thing here is your save button. You want to hit that a lot because then it's going to be saved and not lost. So I'm going to run it and nothing happens. Well, that's not very good. So let me tell you what's happening here. When you press the green button, it's running the Codesters environment. It's assuming you're using all the Codesters tools and it's like a Codesters stage. Print commands go to the console, and here's the Python console. There's a little button down here. And if you click on that, it's kind of like it lifts away the stage curtain and it shows you exactly what you wrote. So I did hello world. And you can actually do other things to the console. I'm going over to the left side here and I'm clicking on the word logic. And if you find where it says console, the Codesters people have some other things that you can do here. So print string. If you click on this, you can either drag it over and it will show you the syntax or what the format is you have to type. If you want to print out variables, you can look here, print out a variable. You can do some other things here, line breaks. You can even do input, and this is kind of interesting. So let me show you how it works if you want to drag something out. So let's say I want to drag out some kind of input. So what this says is, here's a variable called myvar. The equal sign says assign something into this variable, but it's sort of like an ask statement in Scratch or Python, or Codesters Python. What is your name? So again, if I print this now, if I run it, what's my name? So these little things here say it's waiting for it. So I'm going to put in my name, and it did store it in myvar. Well, how do I know that? Well, let's print it out. So I'm going to print out myvar. So if I run this again, typing in my name, it's printing it out. And we can actually make this a little fancier. Why, we can say something like, I'm putting a string here, a literal string, hello, and a space, and then I'm putting in the close string, and then I'm putting this little plus here, and a plus is kind of like a Scratch join statement. It will take the hello, whatever is stored in myvar, and just kind of put them together. So if I were to run this, hello, I'm going to put in my name. Whoops, that's not my name. And then it can put a string out, which is pretty neat. The console is a place where you can really experiment and play around with things. You can also use it for debugging purposes, and hopefully in later videos we can kind of show how this console can be really helpful if you're trying to debug things. But meanwhile, this is kind of like, behind the scenes. It's not really the real Codesters environment. So if I click on this again, I'm going to run this using my Codesters environment, and well, it's nothing there. Everything is under that console. Instead, I want to start using some Codesters things so that we can see something on the stage. So I think for now, I'm going to comment this out. And when I say commenting something out, it's like I don't know if I really want to delete something yet, but I don't want it to run. So a common technique is to comment some code out so it won't run. I'm not quite ready to delete it yet. Maybe I'll want it later. So it's just a little way to kind of just play around with your code when you're first kind of working with it. I'm going to create a little sprite here. that will show up on the Codester stage. You can browse the image library and choose it that way, or you can just kind of scroll through here. What's kind of neat is if you hover just right on some of these, you can actually get a pre-image of them. See when it does that little thing? So that's like person 4, and there's, person 5. And I'm looking for, there's a lot here. Even though they're kind of hard to create your own, they do come with a lot of them. Looking for miscellaneous. Here it is. I'm going to drag over a computer sprite. So you can drag it over. You can also click on, here it is. It's showing me what it's going to look like. And you can also click on this little down arrow key here, and it shows you what the code is, and that's exactly what it put there. So now if I run my Codester stage, I can see that on there. And you actually have different ways that you can put this in here. You can actually put an XY coordinate after here. So if I wanted to go maybe a little to the left, but I still want it to be kind of in the center, in the y-axis, that's what that kind of thing does. So you can do that or not do that. And then if I want this thing to actually do something, so I'm going to go to my actions, and then I'm going to drag out a say. And so what is actually happening here, like if you run this now, it says whatever string you put in here. Basically what's happening is the good people at Codesters have created a library of really interesting, cool graphic things. They've created a class of some kind called Sprite. And so it's Codesters, so they created a library, I guess, called Codesters. This little dot notation says, get something from within this Codesters library called Sprite, and they created what the interface would be. And they want a string, and the string is the name of the different sprite that you want. And it's assigning it to a variable called Sprite. So now whenever you want to reference this computer sprite, you use this name. So this name has methods or little functions associated with it. One of them is the .say method. And you put in a string and it will say that thing. So if I wanted to say something else, I can just change this. And so now when I run it, I get that. So let's say I want to create another sprite. So let's see, I'm going to go back to my sprites, and I want to go back to that miscellaneous area. Whoops. Let's see if I can. I think you could also search up here. There's a little cell phone one that's kind of neat looking. And see if it can find it. There it is. So that's another way of getting things a little bit quicker. This is one of the other sprites, and I want to do the same thing. I want it to say. I'm looking again for that action. And this one's going to say, I am a cell phone. Now, if I run it now, they're kind of overlapping. So I'm going to actually change when I create this second sprite. I'm going to move him maybe a little to the right of the computer screen, and maybe I'll move him a little more left. 0, 0 is the dead center of the screen, so negative 100 says move the X a little bit to the left. Positive 100 says move it to the right, and you can easily just run it and see, yeah, okay, that looks good. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here. First of all, I didn't comment, so I want to do that. I want to make sure I'm very clear what I'm doing. So I'm creating my computer sprite, and I'm careful with my white space because that is a way to make things a little more readable. So I'm going to create my cell phone sprite. And not only are these comments for me, they're for anybody else who might be looking at this code so they can understand what it's doing. Now I have a little problem here. If this is all I want to do, it's probably fine. But what if I want the computer to now say something else? Here's the thing with Python and other languages, if you kind of are reusing the same variable, when I created it up here, it was remembering sort of that computer sprite. But once I reuse that same name, I really can't get to that computer sprite anymore. I should be giving them unique names. So I'm going to rename this one to be computer sprite, and I'm going to rename this one to be cell phone sprite. So that way they have this unique thing. Now what happens now if I run it? We're going to have a problem. And this is what a typical error message looks like. So it says, oops, name sprite is not defined on line 16. And it's doing its best to help you find where the error is. I don't know if you noticed all these numbers down here, but they are line numbers to help you kind of identify different lines of code. And it even went and highlighted that particular line. It's saying, something's fishy here. I'm blowing up. I don't know what to do. And it's saying sprite is not defined. So see, I'm using a variable called Sprite. It doesn't know what that thing is. I have never set it. There is no Sprite equals above it. And that's because I changed its name. So I called it Computer Sprite. So that's the one that has to speak. So this should fix it, right? No, because I have that second Sprite, which is my cell phone Sprite. I don't have anything called plain ordinary Sprite anymore. So I need to change that one too. So now it should work just fine. I hope if I typed everything right. So be very specific when you're naming things. Don't give them silly names that make no sense. You really want to give them names that help describe what you've gotten here so that it's easier to read and follow what's happening. So now at this point, if I want one of the other ones to say something else, I'm going to just have another little conversation here. If I want the computer sprite to say something, I can say, okay, that's the sprite that I want to talk next. How do you do? And then maybe I want the cell phone sprite to answer. Whoops. Right, so now if I run it, it's doing all the things it's supposed to do, so there's no execution errors, but it doesn't look very good. It's hard to see what's happening. Just like in Scratch, you can use wait statements to maybe slow things down because computers are fast. You will find waits under the actions area. So here's a wait, and you could either drag it. So maybe I'll put that here. And these are in seconds, so I don't know how long we want to wait, maybe by 1. And then we'll see if that makes it look a little bit better. Sure. There is one other kind of tricky thing that I want to show you, and that is events. Now when you use Scratch, so they handle events a few different ways. They have some pre-created events when this sprite clicked or when H is pressed or something like that. And they also have broadcast receive. So I want to kind of show you sort of like what broadcast receive is when you're working in Codesters. So I'm going to create a click event for these two sprites. So I'm going to click on this events, and there's lots of different things here, right? So we had these events in Scratch, right? When you hit a left key, a right key, up arrow, down arrow, all those things. But I'm going to do click on Sprite. So these are Sprite events, Sprite click. So I'm down here, and I'm going to just drag it out. And let me just put a comment here so I know what's happening. Now, you know in Scratch you had all these different sprites and all the code was under each sprite. That's not the way it works here. Here is where you can, it's just one big module. And if you're using proper Python, you can put them in different files, but they all kind of have to work together in one big space. You really need to comment everything. You're not going to know what you're looking at. So I'm going to put my event definitions right here. And this first one, right, I just clicked it out, and boy, is this confusing. So when you see that word def is, I think, short for define, and we use that when we create functions. And Scratch doesn't really have functions. They have things that are kind of like functions. Custom blocks are sort of like functions, and even broadcast receive a little bit. But a function is just a snippet of code that something else can call to have it execute. So this one here, I'm going to create a function, whoops, that's not how you spell function, function that, that runs, it's invoked when the computer sprite is clicked. I want to create that one. And remember, what is dragged out is, it's a template, but it's not necessarily complete. So you create a function and you give it this name, and it defaults to the name click. Now each sprite has what's called an event handler, and this event handler for event click for a specific sprite, you have to say, well, what function should I run? So see how click matches this click. So I'm going to change the name of this to be computer sprite click because I want this to be a little more readable. What happens when the computer sprite is clicked? And so I have to match them. So this one has to be computer sprite click. Whoops. And then there is no sprite called Sprite, but I do have one called computer sprite. So what's happening here? I created a function called computer sprite click, and you pass in, this is like a calling parameter. It's a thing that gets passed into the function. I'm going to pass in a sprite. And the event handler kind of handles this automatically. And then I'm going to have that sprite here say something, and you can do a whole bunch, whatever else you want to do in there. And then once that's finished, so Python has this idea of indenting. And so this function ends when these indents end. And I am in the habit of saying, I'm going to put end computer sprite click, because sometimes it's a little hard to tell. Boy, did I spell things wrong here. That's your ending. I'm missing a C up here. And so anything you put here will be what happens when this thing is clicked. This one, which is not indented, it's a new line that's kind of in the scope of the main project. It's saying, hey, that computer sprite, its event click has this name. So that when I run this and I click on the computer sprite, it's going to look for this function and run it. Now this function has to be defined. So I have to define it first, and then I can have an event. Boy, is that confusing. Let's run this. So here's the stuff we did before. Now I have a computer sprite click. So that event is now kind of waiting. So when I click, right, it's saying, oh, you clicked me. Let's run this function here called computer sprite click, and that's what it is. So I don't want it really to say hello name. I'm just going to have it say hello, I'm a computer. Whoops, I'm a computer. Now I can create another event that's for my cell phone. So I can get the template by dragging this out. And I am going to put a comment here. And it is really important to comment any functions you're creating so that you know what they are and that anybody who is reading this can figure out what's happening. And I think you find that code is read more than it's written, so you really want to give it good names. When my cell phone is clicked, I want it to run something. So I could call it click, but give it a better name. I'm going to call this one cell phone sprite click. Whoops. And what's it going to do? It's going to say, hello, I'm a cell phone. This is not the most exciting program ever written. Right? Okay, wonderful. And I'm even going to put a little comment saying, all right, this is the end of this one, so that when I'm reading this later, I can sort of figure out where one thing begins and the other one ends. This is not strictly a required thing. This is more a convention or a good habit maybe to get into. So now I have to define for the cell phone what its event handler is in. Now this is what its event handler is. Now this is called Sprite. I don't have anything called Sprite, but I do have something called cell phone Sprite. And the name of its event handler, when you click on it, is called cell phone sprite click. So I need to put that in. Oops. And I can't guarantee this is perfect. Let's see when we run it if it is or not. So this is the part we already did. So now when I click on this guy, it says, hello, I'm a computer. And hopefully this one will say, hello, I'm a cell phone. There's a lot going on here. It's a lot of new things. If this isn't making sense just yet, that's okay, it will. But it is very different from Scratch, which does a lot of this work for you. You have to do a lot of this on your own. But you can do it in here, and you can have a lot more flexibility, a lot more control. Don't be afraid to play with all the different things here. You are going to want to go through the different lessons, but you are sort of advanced coders if you've already been in other languages, so you might want to also explore in this project area. Before I end this, just a little thing up here. If you want to share your project, you absolutely can. So if I was to share this out, you could share it with people. You've got this little link that you can use. If you know how to embed stuff in websites, it gives you code like that. But it's not really quite a global thing like Scratch is. So it puts things in our class project area, and I can see them and we can see each other's, and that's great. But they are a little bit more private than the Scratch environment, which I think is kind of a good thing. Anyway, this has gone on long enough. Thank you for watching. See you next video.